Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here. We are going over section 3 of segregation and discrimination, talking about what that looked like during the late 1800s into the 1900s, and actually is going to kind of carry on into even up until the 1970s. But the biggest thing that we have to understand is that African Americans have gone through a lot in a very long time. Even after the Civil War was over and there was Reconstruction, the African Americans were still struggling to find a way to show that they were citizens of this country. And Reconstruction gave them an opportunity, a look of what that would be like. But America just fought it so much, just dragged its heels so much that the government just gave up on it, and unfortunately kind of gave up on African Americans. But they still kept fighting. And you're seeing that this process not only happening throughout in this time period you're going to see in the 1800s into all the way up to 1960s, but even following that, the civil rights movement, we're still seeing this happen every day, of African Americans and minority groups fighting segregation, well, mostly discrimination. I mean, segregation, legal segregation doesn't exist, but there are some forms of segregation. All right. So one of the individuals who fought definitely since emancipation, even before emancipation, was Ida Bell Wells. She moved to Memphis in the early 1800s to work as a teacher. She was born into slavery, but became a teacher in Memphis, later became an editor at a local paper. She wrote about racial justice and really focusing on that theme and reporting. And the events of 1992 turned the theme into a crusade. It was more than just, oh, hey, I'm just going to cover this and kind of let people know what's going on. It's like, no, like, this is my passion. Like, this is what I'm going to fight for. I'm going to fight for our freedom. And so 3 African-American businessmen, friends of Wells, were lynched illegally, which is basically executed with a rope without a trial. And Wells saw the lynching for what it was, and that it was basically the society, white society, trying to put down African Americans and take the law in their own hands without really trusting the legal system and letting the legal system do its course. African Americans were experiencing a lot of violence, a lot of racial discrimination around this time. And it's not just them. I mean, Native Americans, Mexican residents, Chinese immigrants, other immigrants were experiencing similar things, but African Americans were targeted the most during this time. As African Americans are trying to show their political, they won their political and their social rights, and they tried to show that throughout Reconstruction, but constant violence from whites kept pushing them back. And so African Americans fell victim to a lot of laws restricting their civil rights. And you didn't have the government step in and go, hey, that's not right. Why are you doing this? These African Americans have a right to vote. They have a right to be citizens of this country. But by 1877, African Americans in the South continued to vote, but and occasionally to hold political office. But by the turn of the 20th century, heading into the 1900s, you're seeing discrimination, racial discrimination, really be highlighted. By 1900, we're seeing many methods to restrict the vote from the African Americans. And then we've got 3 definitions here. Your answer number 10, by the way, is grandfather clause, but here are the definitions for, and they're all different colors. But by 1900, Southern states were trying many ways to do anything they could to restrict the African American vote, because part of the reason why they were trying to restrict the African American vote was, one, because they didn't want African Americans to vote. They didn't feel like that they were worthy of the vote. And 2, the other reason was that if African American voters come out to the polls and really vote, well, they can enact real change. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're seeing so many people fight for voting rights today, is that if everybody who is wanting to make change comes out and actually votes, change can be met. But the problem is voter suppression is real. People are trying to suppress that vote and trying to prevent people from voting because they don't want to lose their seats. And that's what ends up happening is a lot of these white voters back in the 1800s into the 1900s, they don't want to see African Americans get into office. They don't want to see African Americans get local seats. They want African Americans to be treated as second-class citizens because they don't want things to change. The white citizens don't want to lose their superiority over African Americans. So one way to deny the vote was the literacy test and basically test African Americans' reading. And so one way that they did is they had them take a literacy test. But a lot of times what would happen is sometimes in certain, counties and areas, that literacy test was in different languages. Sometimes a language that African Americans did not know how to read. And a lot of it was French, sometimes Spanish, but other languages that basically African Americans would read it, look at it, and go, I have no idea what this says. And they're like, well, I guess you don't know how to read then. And really, it was rigged from the beginning. And even if African Americans could read, basically an official could go, nope, you failed. But they could go, but I just read it word for word. I literally just read it word for word. But it's right. But they go, oh, nope, you failed. Sorry, to restrict the vote. We've seen the poll tax. The poll tax was ultimately a tax that you had to pay. Now, the thing about the poll tax is that it definitely didn't just hurt black voters, but it also hurt white voters too, because especially those who were sharecroppers, because they did not make enough money to pay the tax annually. And so that became a problem because a lot of these farmers, they're just barely getting by with what they can grow and what they can sell. And so it was very difficult. So the poll tax was one way. And then Southerners go, wait a minute, why are we hurting why are we hurting all these poor white farmers? Why are we restricting their right to vote? Why don't we come up with what's called the grandfather clause? And so the grandfather clause was a constitution to let poor whites vote who may have failed the literacy test or couldn't pay the poll tax. So the grandfather clause said that you can vote if self, father, grandfather voted before January 1st of 1867. So why that date specifically? Well, one was because many of those individuals couldn't vote because of the war. And you have to remember, after the Civil War, what we saw happen is that a lot of these individuals couldn't get their right to vote. These white Confederates couldn't get their right to vote until several years later. So before 1867, that was a specific time to be like, oh, you voted before the Civil War, didn't you? Yes, I did. Or your grandfather did. Okay, well, you can vote. So it was basically a way to definitely help white Confederates. The other important reason for that date is because freed slaves didn't have the right to vote by that time. So if you're African American, you can't vote because your grandfather didn't vote. So, and you didn't have the right to vote. So that was a problem. And that was an issue. So obviously it was rigged and set up to prevent African Americans from voting and getting as many white voters as they could to vote. Your definition for Jim Crow laws are here in the blue. By 1870s and 1880s, the Supreme Court allows the poll tax. It's going to be several years later that the poll tax grandfather clause are going to be basically wiped out, and that the Supreme Court is going to go, no, you can't do that. You can't suppress the vote. These laws undermine all federal protections of African American civil rights. And so racial segregation laws, separate races in private and public places, were put in place to continue to restrict African Americans. Not only is the vote being taken away, now they're creating where you can go, where you can eat, where you can sit, where you can enjoy a meal. So segregation laws, called Jim Crow laws, after old minstrel song. Racial segregation was put into effect in schools, hospital, parks, transportation systems throughout the South. That became a problem because with the Jim Crow laws, what if you had to go to the hospital? Not very many black hospitals around your area. If you only had more white hospitals than black hospitals, where is an African American to go to get help? And so that becomes a problem. And then as well as education. Plessy versus Ferguson, your definition's all in blue. There's a fight for the right on segregation. and we see this happening with Homer Plessy. He's a man who's part white, he's part black. He has like 1/8 of African American or black relatives in his DNA. But and so, but he on the surface he kind of looks more white, but he has dark skin, darker tone of skin, and so people classify him as African American. But he is like, look, I'm a mixture of parts. I'm more white than I am black. And he's like, look, I'm gonna go buy a ticket on this train on the whites only section. I think I have the right to be in this area, shouldn't be segregated. But he gets arrested for being in there, and he sues saying that segregation is unconstitutional. And so this happens in Louisiana, and he goes to the courts in Louisiana. They uphold it. They say, nope, you broke the law. You broke the law. Eventually, it's able to go to the Supreme Court, and they test this constitutionally. And the Supreme Court rules in 1896 that segregation is legal in public places. They ruled that separation is legal as long as it's separate but equal, meaning that you can separate both. You can separate both races as long as you provide equal, you provide equal services. So that you have to have a white water fountain to a black water fountain, a white restroom, black restroom. The problem with this is it gets manipulated when it comes to things like education, because a lot of times what would happen is that, okay, yeah, you have a black school and a white school, but let's be honest, the majority of the resources in that town are going to go towards the white schools than the black schools, and so some of the materials, resources are not going to be given to the black schools. You're seeing, okay, we can be on the same bus and transportation, but blacks have to sit in the back. And especially if you're trying to get to on an airplane, they basically would give up more white seats than they would to blacks, and so this becomes a problem, and this becomes an issue. And ultimately, this was the letter of the law until almost 60 years later. It's not going to be until right around into the 1850s that you're going to, or into the 1860s, until this thing is really challenged. So race relations, there's opposing discrimination. We also see other forms of ways to kind of really discriminate. There was a lot of laws that were not written down. It was like unwritten rules per se, like racial etiquette is what it's called, informal rules that weren't written down, but they were what you expect. Basically, it was ways to treat African Americans as second-class citizens. So, for example, black and whites never shook hands. That was a form of equality, implied equality. Also, if you're going down the sidewalk, basically, a black man had to kind of clear the way for the white, couple or white person, and then tip their hat. There was just some of these really weird informal rules that you had to follow if you're African American, and if you didn't do it, you would sometimes get retaliated. There was retaliation, so it was a big problem. So Washington hoped that improving the economic skills for African Americans, Booker T. Washington, would pave the way for long gains. But people like Ida B. Wells, and W.E.B. Du Bois were looking for other ways to solve this problem and not postpone this problem, but make it urgent. Let's fix this now. But the thing about it is African Americans who didn't follow etiquette, who didn't follow the segregation laws, a lot of them got killed. We're looking at more than 1,400 people were killed within a 10-year span of 1882 to 1892. African Americans and others who did not follow the racial etiquette could face severe punishments or death. All too often, you see a lot of them were accused of violating etiquette and were lynched. And some of them weren't even breaking etiquette. But the problem is sometimes you look at somebody the wrong way, they're going to go, you wronged me. And sometimes they would just have this, white people at this time had this hatred for blacks, and that they would just, they would kill people. They would lynch them. Between 1892 and 1892, we see 1,400 African-American men and women were shot, burned, or hanged without a trial. Lynching peaked around this time in 1880s and 1890s. a lot of times that a lot of whites would take the law in their own hands instead of trusting the police, trusting the legal system, and letting them handle this. They took it in their own hands and basically, lynched people, and just broad daylight. Even sometimes it was just awful. It's still awful. It's a tragedy. It's one of those things that has been fought for a long time, and trying to ensure that people were treated equally and not mistreated this way. But it's going to take until the civil rights movement to change this, and even then, even now, we're still seeing these concerns. I mean, lynching may be gone as far as hanging somebody by a rope, but like we're seeing with what's happening in our society, we're seeing others still taking violence in their own hand and using it in different ways instead of trusting the legal system, trusting each other and the law. And it's a sad thing, but it's um, racism is still a problem, and I don't know if it will ever go away. Hopefully, we will be able to suppress it as much as we can and bring it down, and continue to educate others about it. But I don't know if it'll ever go away. Possibly, but I don't know. We'll see. Um, we do see that racial discrimination occurred a lot for African Americans in the South, but a lot of them go up to the North looking for better paying jobs, looking for equality. But when they get there, they go, "Oh, we're going to be discriminated up here in the North as well." It's just there's not as many laws, or there's not as informal etiquette laws that prevent them from enjoying life. I mean, they're still able to. I will say this: segregation is. There's a little bit less of it. There's a little bit less of it in the North, but it's still there. Um, we see our forced into segregated neighborhoods, face discriminated. African Americans are forced into segregated neighborhoods and face discrimination in the workplace. So this became a bit of an issue at times. They were rejected by labor unions. This is something that happened, because here's the thing: like, labor unions didn't want to deal with conflict. They did not want to support African Americans because they were afraid that was going to hurt their union. And so, and also they were African Americans were hired last but fired first. Competition between blacks and working class whites sometimes could get violent and a little bit too far. When it comes back to that labor union thing, it kind of reminds me of the NRA today. When you look at the NRA, there's a lot of African Americans that are NRA members that own rifles, and they are with the NRA. But sometimes you see when it comes to the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment rights, then they feel like the NRA feels like they've been violated. More times they are going to support the white members than they are going to support the black members. There's been a lot of black members who have felt like that they were never supported or have not been supported by the NRA. And we've seen this happen with police shootings, that basically African Americans, basically had the legal right to own their gun, inform the police officer they had a gun legally, but they again still got shot anyways, and the NRA didn't come to their defense. So, so this type of practice of rejecting labor unions rejecting people, that's still kind of happening even in some aspects today, because labor unions or organizations like the NRA are going to choose over what is more successful than take on the risk of losing possibly certain battles. And that's kind of sad. I mean, if you're a member of an organization, you should feel like you should be protected. In New York City, race riot in 1900, violence erupted a lot of times after a young black man, believing that his wife was being mistreated by a white policeman, killed the policeman. Word killing spread, and whites retaliated on the blacks. This would happen a lot of places. It's not just New York City. Eventually, the Tulsa Massacre occurred in Tulsa in the 1920s. Northern blacks, however, were not alone in facing discrimination. Non-whites in the West also faced oppression. Western communities, we see many backgrounds working, living side by side. Native Americans still lived in the Western territories of the United States. Asian immigrants were right around the Pacific coast. Mexican Americans as well continue to inhabit the American West, Southwest, and African Americans were present, especially in former slaveholding areas such as Texas. Still a lot of racial tension with minorities. We see Mexicans in this time were one of the most minority group in the late 1800s, building railroads in the Southwest. They were forced to work with less money. Mexican workers were also vital to the development of mining and agriculture. We see in 1902, National Reclamation Act gave government assistance for irrigation projects. Many Southwest desert areas boomed at this time because of the irrigation, water coming to those areas. Some Southwest Mexican African Americans were forced into debt peonage, which basically was a system of slavery to work off debt to employer. But this ultimately, by 1911, Supreme Court declares this unconstitutional and voluntary peonage a violation of the 13th Amendment. So your answers, 13th Amendment number 9, Mexicans are number 8, and then your definition here for debt peonage. By 1880, more than 100,000 Chinese immigrants lived in the United States. White people feared that their job competition. So Chinese immigrants often push the Chinese into segregated schools and neighborhoods. We see opposition. So opposition to the Chinese immigration leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act. We talked a little bit about this in previous chapters. This opposition to Chinese immigrants developed not only in the West. We see racial discrimination happened and posed terrible legal economic problems for non-whites throughout the United States in the turn of the century. And we see more people, however, whites in particular, had leisure time for new recreational activities, as well as money to spend on growing array of consumer products, which we're going to talk about the growth of the entertainment industry and how that was beginning to become a thing in America. But we'll have only one more section for Chapter 8.